The Second World War was history's clearest example of industrial capacity determining military victory. But if you dig deeper into that victory, you find a single greasy black substance at its core. That substance was Yuo, or Taukeltugi. Germany's war machine stalled and died because it simply ran out of fuel, crippling its Luftwaffe and immobilizing its panzer divisions. Japan's kamikaze pilots flew one-way trips, partly because the nation's supply lines had been choked to the point of desperation by a lack of fuel. In short, modern mechanized war requires petroleum, and without oil, there is simply no victory. This was the simple, brutal lesson the world learned by 1945, and it is the single most important lesson that shaped the next 80 years of American foreign policy. The United States entered the post-war era as the undisputed global economic and industrial superpower. Its infrastructure was intact. Unlike the devastation across Europe and Asia, it possessed a vast, untapped domestic oil supply, which had peaked in production during the war years, giving the Allies a critical advantage. America had the power, the production, the intact logistics, and the domestic resources to lead. But even for a nation this powerful, the future required a strategic eye on its resources. We understood that while America was the world's largest producer, our domestic oil was not infinite. The world, however, was already shifting its focus to the emerging oil fields of the Persian Gulf, a region rich in petroleum controlled by British interests or governed by relatively weak monarchies. The challenge for Washington was clear: how to secure this vast new economic lifeline and integrate it into the Western sphere of influence without triggering a new, resource-driven war. This is the hidden history of American engagement in the Middle East. It's not just a story of democracy and geopolitics. It is a cold, hard economic narrative driven by the need to guarantee access to cheap, abundant energy for the global economy. This access was and remains the economic anchor of American power. Today, we're going to trace the exact moments and policies that transformed American foreign policy from European focus to Middle Eastern obsession, all because of the black gold beneath the sand. We'll start with the moment the policy was set in stone: a secret meeting on a warship in the Suez Canal. It was February of 1945. The war was nearing its end, but the peace was far from secured. On the deck of the USS Quincy, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founder of modern Saudi Arabia. Roosevelt's mission was simple and strategic: secure the future of the Saudi oil fields. The British had been the dominant external power in the region, controlling Iraqi and Persian fields. But American companies, primarily the Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco, had already sunk their wells deep into the Saudi desert. The Quincy meeting established a powerful, unwritten agreement. The U.S. would provide security and military protection for the Saudi monarchy, and in return, the U.S. would gain privileged, stable, and long-term access to Saudi oil. This moment created the Birdie geopolitical foundation for the next 8 decades of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. It was an economic deal dressed up as a diplomatic meeting, exchanging security for resource access. The immediate post-war challenge was the Soviet Union. As the Cold War began, American strategists understood that the economic health and industrial recovery of Western Europe and Japan were the first line of defense against communism. The massive Marshall Plan, a $13 billion aid package, was designed to rebuild European economies and create strong trading partners, thereby preventing communist takeover. But for Europe to rebuild, its factories and transportation systems needed fuel, and cheap Middle Eastern oil provided that necessity. The economic vitality of the West became fundamentally linked to the stability of the Persian Gulf. Any threat to the supply of oil in the Middle East became an existential threat to the economic structure of the entire anti-Soviet bloc. The policy evolved rapidly from protection to prevention. If the United States were going to guarantee the flow of oil, it had to make sure no hostile power, particularly the Soviet Union, gained influence over the producing nations. This led to what became known as the Truman Doctrine. Initially focused on Greece and Turkey, but quickly expanded to a global principle of containing communist expansion. In the Middle East, this translated into active intervention and diplomatic pressure to prop up friendly regimes and ensure that American and British oil companies, not Soviet enterprises, controlled the concessions. This was pure economic containment. Think about the sheer scale of the oil being secured. The U.S. had learned in World War II that its own vast industrial capacity was the decisive weapon. That capacity, however, was predicated on an energy supply. The total oil reserves in the Middle East dwarfed American domestic reserves. Securing them meant securing global economic dominance, not just for the short term, but for generations. It allowed America to preserve its own oil for future crises while fueling its allies and its own growing consumer economy with cheaper foreign oil. This strategic hoarding of domestic reserves while exploiting foreign fields was a profound economic decision that cemented America's post-war superpower status. By the early 1950s, the economic gears of this arrangement were grinding hard against the political aspirations of the Middle Eastern populations. The wealth generated by the oil was flowing almost entirely to Western corporations and a small circle of local elites, creating vast inequality and resentment. We will see how this tension exploded, leading to the first major U.S.-backed coup designed explicitly to protect oil interests. The cost of this policy was not yet measured in blood, but it was already measured in profound political entanglement. The U.S. was no longer just a distant trade partner. It was the protector, the guarantor, and, increasingly, the puppet master of regimes whose sole value to Washington was the stable flow of petroleum. The strategic decision was made. The price of security in the Gulf, whether through military presence or political intervention, was a necessary cost of maintaining the entire global economic system that favored the United States. This decision created a perpetual commitment, a geopolitical check written in the 1940s that the U.S. is still trying to cash today. The economic policy of simply guaranteeing access to cheap Middle Eastern oil was fundamentally challenged in the 1950s by the rise of the nationalism. The resentment against Western-controlled oil companies, which were often seen as relics of old European empires, came to a head in Iran. In 1951, the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh moved to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was the predecessor to British Petroleum. This was an economic act of defiance, a direct challenge to the post-war arrangement where Western corporations controlled the production and profits of the oil. For Washington and London, this act could not be tolerated. If Iran successfully nationalized its oil and dictated its own terms, the domino effect across Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the Gulf states would collapse the entire economic foundation of the Western world. The response was covert and swift. In 1953, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and British intelligence orchestrated a coup, codenamed Operation Ajax, that successfully overthrew Mossadegh and restored the pro-Western High Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to power. This was perhaps the clearest early example of American foreign policy prioritizing resource economics over democratic principles. The economic goal was achieved. The Iranian oil fields were secured, shared among several Western firms, and the stable flow of oil continued, keeping the price low. This intervention established a dangerous precedent that the U.S. would use covert action to safeguard its access to strategic resources. However, the oil-producing nations were learning the economic leverage they possessed. In 1960, an organization was quietly founded in Baghdad, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. Initially, OPEC's goal was modest: to coordinate production and prevent Western companies from continually lowering the price of crude oil and decreasing the revenues of the host nations. But by the 1970s, this cartel of producing nations had found its true power. The economic game had fundamentally changed from securing access to controlling price and supply. The most dramatic shift occurred during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. In response to American support for Israel, the Arab members of OPEC instituted an oil embargo against the United States and other Western nations. For the American consumer, the immediate impact was gas lines and panic. But for the global economy, the effect was cataclysmic. Oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. This single economic weapon demonstrated the vulnerability of the entire post-war system. The stable, cheap energy that had powered the post-war boom and the Marshall Plan recovery was no longer guaranteed. The American economic anchor had been violently yanked. In response to this profound economic shock, the U.S. government, under the guidance of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, engineered a brilliant financial counter-strategy, the RET, Petrodollar system. This was the ultimate economic hidden gear. The U.S., primarily through a series of agreements with Saudi Arabia in 1974, guaranteed that Saudi oil, and by extension most of the world's oil, would be priced and traded exclusively in U.S. dollars. Think about the economic brilliance of this move. When a nation like Japan or Germany buys oil from Saudi Arabia, they must first purchase U.S. dollars to complete the transaction. This artificially creates a massive, perpetual global demand for the U.S. dollar, regardless of American economic performance. This demand is what allows the U.S. to print money and sustain its massive trade and fiscal deficits without its currency collapsing. The U.S. was exchanging its security guarantee for Saudi oil, but now it was also exchanging that security for the very privileged status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. This petrodollar system solidified the economic link between the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy, making it even more rigid. Any threat to the stable rule of Saudi Arabia or any other major oil producer became a direct threat to the financial architecture of the United States. This economic imperative drove the U.S. response to the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, both of which threatened regional stability and, by extension, the dollar's dominance. The culmination of this economic policy came in 1991 with the First Gulf War. When Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded Kuwait, he threatened not just a sovereign nation, but the economic stability of the region, specifically the vast oil reserves of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. President George H.W. Bush mobilized a massive international coalition, and the stated goal was the liberation of Kuwait. But the underlying economic reality, the hidden gear driving the policy, was the absolute non-negotiable need to secure the region's oil flow and protect the petrodollar system. The war was, in essence, an extremely costly intervention, a total of $296 billion for the U.S. effort in World War II, versus an estimated $71 billion in direct cost for Desert Storm. But it was considered the necessary expense to safeguard trillions of dollars in global economic stability. The decades-long policy has created a profound and lasting legacy. The U.S. went from a nation concerned about its own oil reserves to the guarantor of the world's most critical energy supply. This economic policy has determined military deployments, dictated diplomatic alliances, and financed trillions in trade deficits. Today, even with the rise of U.S. domestic shale oil production, the global economic importance of Middle Eastern oil and the foundational structure of the petrodollar system mean that the region remains an unshakable anchor for American foreign policy. The financial prize was too large, the economic risks of retreat too high, and the costs of intervention, no matter how severe, were always calculated as a necessary expense to maintain superpower status. The economic commitment established at the end of World War II came with a perpetual and escalating price tag, and that price was paid most dramatically in the two Iraq wars. While the First Gulf War was a swift operation to protect the physical integrity of the oil fields and the Saudi monarchy, the WWII invasion of Iraq presented a far more complex and costly economic calculation. Ostensibly, the war was about weapons of mass destruction and regime change, but the underlying motivation was undeniably linked to energy security, regional control, and the future of the petrodollar system. The invasion's planning involved assumptions about the financial self-sufficiency of the conflict. The administration believed that Iraq's vast, high-quality oil reserves, the fifth largest in the world, could be rapidly restored to production. This oil revenue, it was argued, would pay for the nation's reconstruction and the cost of the military occupation itself. This belief, however, proved to be one of the most significant and costly economic miscalculations in modern history. The costs escalated far beyond initial projections, turning what was hoped to be an economically self-sustaining operation into a trillion-dollar burden. On the American taxpayer, the U.S.-led intervention unleashed a massive, multi-decade financial commitment. While the direct war spending is staggering, the true economic cost of the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan is far more complex and enduring. The Brown University Costs of War project, using conservative estimates, has placed the total financial burden of the post-9/11 wars well into the multiple trillions of dollars. Factoring in not just the bullets and tanks, but the long-term, inescapable costs. These inescapable costs include the lifetime care for hundreds of thousands of veterans. This involves medical treatment, disability payments, and long-term care for injuries both physical and mental. A perpetual bill that will extend decades into the future. It also includes the massive interest payments on the borrowed money used to finance the conflicts. The U.S. government chose to finance the wars almost entirely through debt rather than increased taxes, a stark contrast to the financing of World War II, which was paid for 45% by taxes and 55% by war bonds and debt. This decision created a long-term economic drain, pushing the national debt higher and diverting billions of taxpayer dollars annually to interest payments instead of domestic priorities. The sheer scale of the financial miscalculation in Iraq illustrates the economic vulnerability created by the resource-driven foreign policy. The U.S. went into the region to protect a trillion-dollar global economic system based on oil and the dollar, but, in the process, incurred a multi-trillion-dollar direct cost. This cost was incurred not just through war fighting, but through the immense, complex, and often corrupt logistics required to sustain a foreign occupation. Every meal, every gallon of fuel, every private security contract had to be shipped over vast supply lines, making the logistics alone a financial juggernaut. Furthermore, the economic rationale of using Iraqi oil to pay for the war never materialized as planned. Production was consistently hampered by insurgent attacks, political instability, and massive infrastructure damage. Instead of a revenue stream, the U.S. was left with a massive expense, proving that the economic calculus of war must always account for the EDRC, cost of instability. The very act of intervention, meant to secure a resource, often creates the very instability that drives up the cost and threatens the supply. The economic consequences extended beyond the direct costs. The war contributed to regional instability that fueled terrorist groups, disrupted supply lines, and ultimately led to further military engagements, each adding to the financial ledger. It also diverted massive amounts of capital and intellectual resources away from domestic investment and innovation, a classic example of the avoided opportunity cost of conflict. The money spent on maintaining the occupation could have been used to fund infrastructure, education, or scientific research, accelerating growth in those areas. The hidden gears of oil and empire continued to spin, but the mechanism had become vastly more expensive and less efficient. The original deal, security for cheap access, had become an endless commitment to security for unstable access at exorbitant cost. The economic logic that drove the U.S. into the Middle East in the 1940s created a self-perpetuating cycle of intervention and debt by the 21st century. The financial lesson is clear. Protecting global economic stability through military intervention is not a one-time charge. It is a permanent, rising subscription fee, paid for by the American taxpayer for generations to come. The early 21st century presented a profound economic paradox regarding Middle Eastern oil. While the U.S. commitment to the region remained absolute, the underlying energy dynamics began to shift dramatically. The key was the shale revolution. Advances in hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, unlocked vast oil and natural gas reserves in the United States, rapidly transforming the nation from a major oil importer to one of the world's leading oil and gas producers. This shift drastically reduced America's reliance on Middle Eastern imports. On the surface, this domestic production boom should have allowed the U.S. to pull back its military and financial commitments, finally realizing the Manfuat dividend that never materialized after the Cold War. Yet, this is the crux of the petroleum paradox. Even as America became energy independent, its geopolitical commitment to the Middle East remained firmly in place. The reason for this continued commitment is purely economic, and it is tied directly back to the petrodollar system we discussed earlier. American foreign policy is no longer just about securing oil for American cars. It's about securing the global economy that benefits America. The U.S. commitment shifted from securing supply for itself to securing the price and stability of the oil traded in U.S. dollars. Instability in the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil flows, would trigger a global economic recession, devastating the economies of U.S. allies like Germany and Japan, and, critically, undermining the financial stability of the petrodollar. Therefore, the military presence became less about a domestic energy need and more about a global financial obligation. This obligation manifests in several ways. First, the U.S. continues to provide enormous military support and arms sales to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf monarchies. These are not merely alliances based on shared values. They are economic maintenance contracts, designed to ensure the stability of the regimes that anchor the petrodollar system. Second, the U.S. naval presence, particularly the Fifth Fleet, is essentially a global oil police force, ensuring the uninterrupted flow of oil through critical choke points, a mission that prevents price spikes that could cripple the world economy. The financial pressure on these Gulf states is also a key economic gear. As the world moves toward energy transition and renewables, the long-term economic viability of petrostates is uncertain. The U.S. commitment to the region is now aimed not just at protecting oil exports, but at protecting oil revenues, which are then often cycled back into U.S. financial markets and arms purchases. This cyclical flow of capital solidifies the U.S. Gulf economic relationship, making both parties highly dependent on the status quo. The rise of competing powers, specifically China and Russia, adds another layer to the economic calculus. Both nations have sought to challenge the petrodollar system, attempting to negotiate oil deals in currencies other than the U.S. dollar, such as the Chinese yuan. For the U.S., this is an existential economic threat, far more serious than any localized military conflict. A widespread shift away from dollar-denominated oil trade would erode the immense global advantage the U.S. currently holds, threatening to destabilize the entire U.S. financial structure. This means the geopolitical struggle in the Middle East has now become an economic currency war, with oil as the primary battlefield. This modern economic complexity confirms the central thesis. The World War II lesson that oil is the key to global power has been internalized and evolved. It's no longer just a question of having enough fuel, but of controlling the satito system through which that fuel is traded and priced. The economic link between oil and foreign policy has become institutionalized, deeply woven into the fabric of the global financial system. To secure the dollar, the U.S. must secure the oil, even if it no longer needs the oil for itself. The legacy of this commitment is not just financial, it is ethical and social. The pursuit of economic stability in the Gulf has often required the U.S. to overlook human rights abuses, support autocratic regimes, and engage in costly, destabilizing military conflicts. The cost of maintaining the petrodollar and the global economic order is an endlessly recurring bill, measured in trillions of dollars, but also in the long-term erosion of American moral and financial capital. The hidden gears of oil and empire are still turning, and they continue to dictate the terms of America's engagement with the world. The long history of U.S. engagement in the Middle East, viewed through the cold lens of economic calculus, offers several profound lessons for understanding the costs of empire and the true nature of resource-driven foreign policy. The first, and arguably the most important lesson, is that economic preparation before a war matters immensely. In World War II, the Allies possessed the resources, the production, and the logistics, whereas the Axis lacked at least one of these critical pillars. In the post-war era, the U.S. failed to adequately plan for the financial logistics of peacetime empire enforcement, leading to multi-trillion-dollar debts. The initial success of the U.S. in securing Middle Eastern oil was a testament to sound strategic thinking in 1945. It set the stage for the post-war American economic boom, fueled by cheap, reliable energy. However, this success masked a fundamental vulnerability. Total war requires total economic mobilization, but maintaining a global economic system requires total financial commitment, often in perpetuity. The costs of occupation, intervention, and long-term security guarantees are vastly higher and more complicated than the initial cost of securing the resource concessions. One of the most critical economic takeaways is the concept of the perpetual bill. The decision to finance conflicts through massive debt, rather than taxes, creates a compounding interest obligation that outlives the conflict itself. The cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars is estimated to be still rising decades from now, driven almost entirely by veteran health care and interest payments. This fiscal choice fundamentally transfers the burden of imperial economics onto future generations, ensuring that past policy decisions continue to drain current budgets, often diverting resources from critical domestic infrastructure or technology development. Furthermore, the economic narrative challenges the notion of a-strategic bombing as a solely military endeavor. The success of the Allied effort to dismantle the German war economy by focusing on critical targets like oil refineries and transportation networks proved that economic warfare is devastating. However, the cost of that effort, in bombers and trained crews lost, was immense. The lesson for modern policy is that economic targeting is effective, but it is often less effective and more costly than post-war analysis initially suggested, requiring a massive opportunity cost. This points to the need for restraint in resource-driven conflict, where the expense of securing the asset can easily outweigh its potential profit. Another key lesson involves the necessity of QT innovation and technology to overcome resource dependencies. When the Japanese conquered 90% of the natural rubber supply in Southeast Asia, the U.S. launched a massive, successful synthetic rubber program. This wartime investment accelerated technology by decades in many fields, including computing and nuclear power. The shale revolution, decades later, was another technological victory over dependence. The long-term economic solution to resource security is not necessarily military enforcement of supply lines, but rather technological innovation that bypasses the dependency entirely. This creates a superior, more resilient economic base. Finally, the most profound lesson is about economic interdependence. The creation of the petrodollar system made the U.S. dollar the world reserve currency, granting the U.S. immense economic power and stability. However, this power came with the immense burden of being the sole global guarantor of the system. The U.S. cannot simply walk away from the Middle East without triggering a financial crisis that would destabilize the very global economic order it built. This makes the economic ties between the U.S. and the Gulf states less of an alliance and more of a geopolitical codependency. The story of oil and empire is therefore a cautionary tale of economic success breeding strategic rigidity. The World War II triumph in production and resource security led to a post-war foreign policy that prioritized resources above all else, often at the expense of democratic values or long-term financial stability. The hidden gears, the petrodollar, the strategic hoarding of domestic reserves, the security for access deals, delivered global dominance, but they also locked the U.S. into a series of expensive, continuous military and financial obligations. Understanding these economic drivers is crucial to understanding the last 70 years of global conflict. The foundation of the oil-based economic empire is now being actively challenged by global competitors, transforming the resource war into a currency war. For decades, the petrodollar system operated unchallenged, providing the U.S. with immense financial leverage. The sheer volume of oil traded globally ensured that the demand for U.S. dollars remained artificially high, creating what the French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously called America's exorbitant privilege. This privilege allows the U.S. to borrow and spend at historically low rates without suffering the same inflationary pressures as other nations. The rise of two specific economic powers, China and Russia, has directly targeted this system. For both nations, the petrodollar represents the ultimate symbol of American economic hegemony, and undermining it is a strategic priority. Russia, facing Western sanctions, has aggressively sought to denominate its own massive energy exports in currencies other than the dollar, primarily euros or its own ruble, as a form of economic counter-aggression. While Russia's share of the global oil market is substantial, The larger, more enduring threat to the petrodollar comes from China. China is the world's largest oil importer, and its economic relationship with major producers, including Saudi Arabia, has deepened significantly. Beijing has made deliberate attempts to negotiate oil and gas deals priced in the Chinese yuan, often using its economic strength and deep infrastructure investment to persuade producers to bypass the dollar. In 2018, China launched its yuan-denominated oil futures contract in Shanghai, a direct, visible challenge to the dollar's dominance in energy trade. While the yuan contracts currently represent only a small fraction of global oil trading, the symbolic and long-term potential for disruption is significant. For American foreign policy, this economic competition introduces a new dimension to its Middle East strategy. Protecting the Gulf states is no longer solely about securing the physical flow of oil. It's about preventing a widespread shift in the post-WWII currency of trade. Any move by a major producer to consistently sell oil in a non-dollar currency would immediately reduce the global demand for the dollar, raising U.S. borrowing costs, accelerating inflation, and potentially triggering a deep financial crisis. Therefore, the U.S. security umbrella over the Gulf is fundamentally a guarantee against the financial collapse of the region's dollar-anchored economies. When the U.S. sells billions of dollars in advanced weaponry to Saudi Arabia, it is not merely a defense transaction. It is an economic transaction that ensures petrodollars are recycled back into the U.S. economy, further cementing the financial bond. This continuous recycling of petrodollars back into U.S. government bonds, Wall Street investments, and defense contracts is the mechanism that perpetuates the entire system. This currency war dynamic forces the U.S. into increasingly complex diplomatic situations. For instance, maintaining the strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia, despite geopolitical disagreements or concerns over human rights, is deemed an unavoidable economic imperative. The sheer financial risk of alienating the primary anchor of the petrodollar system outweighs the perceived political cost. This calculation demonstrates how the foundational economic policy set in 1945 continues to dictate the terms of American moral and ethical engagement in the 21st century. The economic cost of empire has thus evolved from direct military spending to the cost of maintaining a multi-layered financial defense system. This defense requires constant vigilance, massive arms deals, and continuous military presence, all expenses incurred to preserve the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. The fate of the U.S. economy is, by design, tied to the geopolitical stability of a distant, volatile region, confirming the economic rule that the winners had not just resources and production, but a strategy for ensuring logistical and financial control over those resources. The final chapter in the story of oil and empire is still being written, characterized by two competing economic forces: decarbonization and financial inertia. The global push toward net zero emissions and the rapid adoption of renewable energy sources fundamentally threaten the long-term economic model of the petrostates. Every advance in battery technology, solar power, and wind energy reduces the future value of the oil that has defined the last century of geopolitics. This poses a unique strategic and economic dilemma for American foreign policy that has no historical precedent. For the United States, this energy transition presents a profound, multi-generational foreign policy challenge. The core question is, when the oil is no longer the world's most critical commodity, how does America unwind its 80-year-old commitment to the region without collapsing the petrodollar system? The economic anchor of the U.S. dollar is tied to oil, and the transition away from fossil fuels threatens to remove that anchor, potentially leading to financial instability and a decline in American economic dominance. The major economic players in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, are keenly aware of this existential threat. They are now engaging in massive economic diversification projects, investing their oil wealth into tourism, technology, and entertainment to survive the coming shift. These projects, however, still rely on the current high price and stable flow of oil revenues, which in turn still rely on the U.S. security guarantee. This creates a final perverse economic cycle. The U.S. must continue to protect the oil producers so they can earn enough money to successfully transition away from oil, which will eventually make the U.S. security commitment obsolete. The hidden gears of resource economics are now grinding against the global movement towards climate economics. This new tension is driving foreign policy decisions today. The U.S. is subtly shifting its focus in the region, prioritizing technology partnerships, alternative energy security, and competition with China and Russia in the non-oil sectors. However, the legacy of past economic decisions, the massive debt incurred, the established military bases, the deeply ingrained diplomatic relationships, makes a clean break impossible. The financial inertia of the military-industrial complex and the long-term costs of veteran care ensure that the U.S. will be paying for the oil wars for decades to come, even as it seeks to pivot its strategic focus to other regions. The ultimate lesson of the economic link between oil and empire is that economic strategy defines military strategy. World War II taught the world that production capacity was victory. Post-war geopolitics taught the world that resource control was global dominance. The 21st century is now teaching the world that technological independence and financial resilience are the keys to future power. In the end, the economic cost of empire has been staggering. The initial investment of securing the oil has mushroomed into a multi-trillion-dollar commitment that has dictated military strategy, shaped financial policy, and cost thousands of lives. It is a powerful reminder that every major geopolitical event, from a coup in Iran to a war in the Gulf, is underpinned by a cold, hard economic calculation. The factory won World War II more than any general, and the refinery, the pipeline, and the petrodollar system have determined the shape of the world ever since. So, the next time you hear about a major foreign policy crisis in the Middle East, remember the hidden gears. Remember the meeting on the USS Quincy and the fourfold price jump of the 1970s. The U.S. is not just securing a nation, it's securing a multi-trillion-dollar financial system built on a foundation of oil. It is a perpetual maintenance contract on global economic stability. If you found this economic breakdown compelling, hit the like button and let us know which other conflict you want us to analyze next through the lens of cost and finance. Was the Marshall Plan a foreign policy act, or the best investment in trade partners in history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Gears for more deep dives into the economic machinery of history. To fully grasp the economic logic of the U.S. oil empire, we must circle back to the Marshall Plan, arguably the most successful foreign policy initiative of the post-war era. It provides a perfect contrast to the costly, long-term military interventions in the Middle East. The Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program, channeled $13 billion in aid, which is approximately $150 billion in modern terms, into rebuilding Western European economies between 1948 and 1952. This was not an act of pure altruism. It was an act of profound economic self-interest and a strategic calculation against the spread of communism. The economic goal was dual. First, to provide the capital necessary to restart European industries, and second, to create strong, stable trading partners for the booming American economy. The logic was simple. A Europe mired in poverty and economic chaos would inevitably turn toward communism or fascism, creating unstable regimes and destroying lucrative export markets for American goods. By investing heavily in their recovery, the U.S. was essentially buying long-term customers and allies. This was the ultimate economic multiplier effect. The initial investment created a generation of stability and wealth across the Atlantic, which in turn purchased trillions of dollars of American exports over the ensuing decades. Critically, the Marshall Plan's success was underpinned by the assumption that cheap, available energy, namely Middle Eastern oil, would fuel this recovery. The U.S. was essentially providing the capital, while its security arrangements in the Gulf were guaranteeing the fuel supply. The Marshall Plan was the demand-side solution. The Quincy meeting was the supply-side solution. Together, they formed the economic engine of the new Western world order. However, the Marshall Plan also created its own economic burden. The aid was a massive financial outflow, which had to be justified to the American public and Congress. The success of the program proved that economic investment, not just military intervention, was a powerful tool of foreign policy. This is the core lesson that often gets lost in the conversation about the Middle East. Sometimes the most cost-effective and stabilizing strategy is to invest in economic development rather than military deterrence. The comparison between the Marshall Plan and the Iraq War costs is staggering. For a fraction of the eventual multi-trillion-dollar cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the Marshall Plan secured the long-term allegiance, economic prosperity, and stability of a continent, all while boosting American exports and securing the political victory in the Cold War. It was, in effect, a massive, successful foreign direct investment, with an outstanding rate of return measured in geopolitical stability and trade. The long-term success of the Marshall Plan also highlights the importance of post-war economic decisions in shaping the next 70 years. Unlike the punitive demands of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, which crippled the German economy and contributed to the rise of extremism, the Marshall Plan provided capital and a framework for democratic, market-based recovery. This decision prevented the cycle of resentment and instability that had characterized the post-World War I era. The decision to choose a path of investment over punishment was a key economic differentiator for the U.S. The post-war economic decisions regarding Europe and Japan, which were rebuilt with U.S. aid and investment, leading to their own economic miracles, stands in sharp contrast to the financial and military commitment chosen for the resource-rich Middle East, which led to a cycle of intervention and debt. Both policies were rooted in securing the U.S. sphere of influence, but the methods and the resulting costs were worlds apart. This economic history demonstrates that the choice between military cost and economic investment often determines the long-term success of a foreign policy objective. The hidden gear here is that a wise, upfront investment can save trillions in future military enforcement and political instability. The Marshall Plan remains the gold standard of effective economic diplomacy, a model that the U.S. often seems to forget when the allure of securing cheap oil overrides the logic of stable trade partnership. The shift of American foreign policy toward the Middle East was not just about establishing a new economic order. It was also the final, strategic move that dismantled the remnants of the British Empire. Before World War II, the British held substantial economic and political sway across the region, controlling crucial oil fields in Persia and Iraq. The U.S. entry into Saudi Arabia, secured by the Quincy meeting, was a direct incursion into the established British sphere of influence, signaling a transition from British to American economic and military hegemony. The British exit was hastened by their dire financial state after World War II. The United Kingdom had punched above its weight in the war, contributing significantly to the Allied cause with its air force and tank production. However, the war left the UK financially exhausted and deeply in debt, having received $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid from the US. This financial exhaustion was so complete that it took decades to repay the debt, with the final payment made only in 2006. This economic weakness meant that Britain simply could not afford the military and financial commitment necessary to maintain its global empire. The US, with its intact infrastructure and dominant industrial base, stepped into the void. The British failure to contain the Iranian nationalization movement in 1951 and the subsequent American-led coup in 1953 definitively established the new geopolitical reality. The U.S. was now the guarantor of Western oil interests, effectively ending the era of British dominance. The oil weapon was thus wielded not just against adversaries, but also strategically against a weakening ally. The U.S. used its financial strength and its burgeoning oil interests to supplant the former imperial power. The economic lesson for the U.S. was that the cost of maintaining a global empire, as the British discovered, eventually outweighs the benefits if the financial foundation is not robust. America's ability to take on the role of global oil guarantor was a direct consequence of its superior industrial capacity and intact financial resources compared to its exhausted allies. The transfer of power was solidified by the Suez Crisis in 1956. When Britain, France, and Israel launched a coordinated attack on Egypt after the nationalization of the Suez Canal, the U.S., fearing a Soviet counter-intervention and a disruption to the global oil supply, pressured its allies to withdraw. The U.S. effectively vetoed the military action of its allies using economic and diplomatic pressure, demonstrating that American economic interests, chiefly stable oil flow, superseded the colonial interests of the old European powers. The economic link to oil was now the ultimate foreign policy determinant, not just in the fight against communism, but in the reorganization of the Western alliance itself. The legacy of the British collapse serves as a perpetual warning for the U.S. No amount of military power can compensate for a collapsing financial foundation. The British lost their empire because they were financially exhausted and dependent on U.S. aid, setting the stage for the American oil empire to take its place. This cycle of resource-driven economic and political decline is the ultimate hidden gear of imperial history, the narrative of energy independence. In the United States, fueled by the shale revolution, is a powerful political tool, but from an economic foreign policy perspective, it is largely a myth. While the U.S. produces more oil and gas than ever before, making it less reliant on physical imports, the economic ties and geopolitical commitments established over 80 years remain unbreakable. This is the final, crucial nuance in the economics of oil and empire. The myth is that domestic production allows the U.S. to withdraw from the Middle East. The reality, as we have seen, is that the U.S. commitment is no longer about securing barrels for itself, but about securing the POIPON global financial system, anchored by the petrodollar. A conflict in the Persian Gulf that causes the price of oil to spike to $100 or $200 a barrel hurts the American consumer just as much as, if not more than, it did before the shale boom. Why? Because the price of oil is set on a global market, not a domestic one. Furthermore, U.S. oil companies, now major global exporters, benefit immensely from the stable dollar-denominated global market enforced by the U.S. military. The U.S. military presence in the Gulf is now, in part, securing the export market. Woe for American crude oil, ensuring its price and saleability. This means the military is indirectly acting as a subsidy for the U.S. energy industry, a continuous cost paid by the taxpayer to ensure the profitability of the energy sector. The true hidden gear of this final phase is the OPEC economic cost of transition. The U.S. has an interest in maintaining global oil stability precisely because an unstable transition away from oil, marked by price volatility and geopolitical chaos, could cripple the emerging green technology sector and the broader economy. The U.S. must manage the decline of the oil-based economy to ensure that the shift to renewable energy is smooth, stable, and does not open the door to major financial or geopolitical shocks. This necessity ties the U.S. to the region for the foreseeable future, not as an oil buyer, but as a transition manager. In conclusion, the story of oil and empire is one of immense economic power that came with an even more immense continuous financial obligation. The post-war policy decision to link U.S. security to Middle Eastern oil created a self-perpetuating system that cost trillions, dictated diplomatic choices, and profoundly shaped the modern world. The hidden gears, the Quincy deal, the petrodollar, the financial inertia, and the current currency wars have all ensured that the economic costs of war are not just paid by a single generation, but compounded into a perpetual national debt. The legacy of the oil empire will be measured not only by the wealth it created, but by the financial burden it left behind.